Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Welcome to our webinar for the Asia-Pacific program in Chatham House on the Republic of Korea as a global pivotal state, assessing its strategic capabilities. My name is John Nilsson-Wright. I'm the Korea Foundation Fellow here at Chatham House and also an Associate Professor at Cambridge University. Good morning to those of you who are joining us from the UK or Europe, and good evening to those of you who are joining us from Seoul. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here for our discussion on this very critical question about the role of South Korea as a regional and global actor. Let me begin by thanking our sponsors, the Korea Foundation, which sponsors the Korea Foundation Fellowship here at Chatham House, and also the Taejae Academy in Seoul, which has been a long-term supporter of our career-related work at Chatham House. Just to remind you, a few housekeeping matters. This meeting is on the record and will be recorded and then subsequently put on the Chatham House website. For those of you who would like to ask questions, can I encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, not the chat or raise hand function. As you will have seen from the description of today's meeting, we have three distinguished speakers who will be speaking for 5 minutes or so each. And then there's going to be a brief exchange between myself and the panelists, digging into some of the issues that they will have been touching upon in their presentations before I open it up to further discussion with you, the audience. So I hope we will have an opportunity to exchange views and to share perspectives on this really important question. Without further ado, let me begin by introducing briefly our speakers in the order in which they will be presenting. First, Ambassador Yoon Suk-yeol, recently appointed as Ambassador to the United Kingdom. I had the pleasure of seeing the Ambassador on Monday for an event at his residence. It's a great pleasure to have you with us, Ambassador. Ambassador Yoon was formerly Ambassador to Egypt. He's been a member of the Korean Foreign Ministry since 1985. Served in a variety of places in the United States, Cote d'Ivoire. He also, very importantly, I think, in terms of thinking about this question of Korea's global role, was Chief of Protocol at the United Nations and worked very closely with United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Second, Wee Sung-lak, also a veteran of the Foreign Ministry, where he served for 36 years before his retirement. He is now Secretary General of the Korea Peace Foundation, based in Seoul. I had the pleasure of meeting him when he was then Director General, I think, of the North American Bureau many years ago in Seoul. It's wonderful to see you again. Wee Sung-lak served as Deputy Chief of Mission in the United States. Importantly, I think in terms of some of the issues I'm sure we'll talk upon in relation to North Korea, he was also Chief Negotiator for the six-party talks, and is very familiar to Chatham House audiences, participated in a very interesting podcast about a year or so ago, and has also visited Chatham House on previous occasions. As has our final speaker, last but not least, Jun Hae-won. Professor Jun is an Associate Professor at the Institute for Foreign Affairs and National Security, or IFANS, which is part of the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, which trains South Korea's diplomats. She has a DPhil from Oxford University, an MSc from the London School of Economics. She has taught at a number of South Korean universities, including Sogang University and Yonsei University. Very importantly for our discussion today, she is a Europe specialist who has focused in particular on EU-Korea crisis management, issues relevant to NATO, and European politics more generally. So she's very familiar with the political landscape as seen from here, but will therefore be very well placed to talk about the question of the relationship between Korea and the United Kingdom and Europe more broadly. So without further ado, could I invite our first speaker, Ambassador Yoon, to kick off our discussion with a brief presentation. Ambassador Yoon.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning and good evening to those who join us from Korea. To the audience, I'd like to say I'm the new ambassador of the Republic of Korea to the United Kingdom. And I'm very glad to have this opportunity, thanks to Professor John Nilsson-Wright of Chatham House And with such distinguished panelists like Ambassador Wee Sung-nak, who I have tremendous respect. He is known as one of the best strategists in whole foreign ministry history. And Professor Jun, I'm also happy to meet today. I understand that she's a very strong UK hand we have at the IFANS. Well, the Yoon administration, my namesake, announced its aspiration to become a global pivotal state, or GPS, in short, as the guiding principle of its foreign policy. But what does that mean? I wondered. Global, fine. Pivotal, well. But I soon realized that the change of our policy is that we will work differently. So far, we talked about our own achievement, like a full-fledged democracy and the world's 10th largest economy that we have achieved. But now with that global status, what are we going to do? We have to go global. We should break out of endless reflection on our own issues and take on our share of responsibility to promote freedom, peace, and prosperity in the world. Korea will uphold core values of democracy, the rule of law, and human rights in solidarity with nations that share these values. We will also work with our partners to build a vibrant and prosperous Indo-Pacific, enhance supply chain resiliency, expand networks of economic security, and tackle our common challenges of climate change and digital divide. Korea will also play an active role in promoting peaceful resolutions of disputes and conflicts through dialogue. This includes our efforts to achieve complete denuclearization of North Korea. Yes, once again, our own problem, but with global implications. Korea has been grappling with the North Korean nuclear issue for the last 30 years. After the first North Korean crisis was avoided with the agreed framework, the US government tried the Perry process in 1999 to probe a possible dialogue with the North while gauging the implication of North's nuclear and missile program. At that time, Ambassador Wee and I were working together in the Korean delegation. Ambassador Wee was a director at the Blue House, and I was a deputy director for North American Affairs Division. We had the first meeting of Trilateral Coordination Group, or TCOG, with the United States and Japan. That was created as a result of consultation led by former Secretary Perry and his deputy, Ambassador Wendy Sherman, who was debuting as diplomat at the time. With the Sunshine Policy en vogue, the Korean media focused on Perry's engagement with the North, but the same report also warned that the mating of nuclear capability with long-range missiles would provide a threat to the US forces in the region and create a more precarious situation for South Korea. The warning, unfortunately, has become a reality now. With many administrations in Korea that followed, the South Korean strategies remained more or less the same in essence, a mix of stick and carrot, or punishment and reward, with slightly different sequencing or prioritizing. But what I believe makes difference between those approaches is credibility. Your warning should be credible and your reward should be credible to change your opponent's moves. In that regard, the audacious initiative by President Yoon offers genuine, credible options. Our determination to deter the North's provocation, dissuade it from further nuclear and missile development, and bring it to dialogue so that they are our 3Ds after GPS is clear. Why? Because our words are backed by our actions. With provocations from the North, we bolstered our defense posture and took corresponding measures when necessary. Particularly, we are undertaking our trilateral cooperation in earnest, not pro forma, in our diplomatic and defense areas. But if the North takes a sincere step toward denuclearization, we will be quick and daring to work for the initial sanction exemption for sale of minerals for humanitarian purpose like food, medicine, and fertilizer. The further they go, the further we will go, even helping modernization of its obsolete power grid and transportation infrastructure. Maybe our credibility on deterrence can let them see how sincere we will be in rewarding their good behavior. Now, I wish to come back to the theme of this session given in the form of a question on strategic capabilities. I like to say it has never been a matter of capabilities. It has been a matter of political will. The will to join the international community with our affirmation and strong support for universal values and norms. The will to test the North to see whether they really mean what they say, to clarify what their true intentions are, to impose penalty when they break their own words. Capabilities have always been there, I guess. This administration comes with that will to right the wrongs of the past, which will add credibility to what it says. And how does the audacious initiative fit into our vision of global pivotal state? Our commitment to playing the role of GPS by promoting freedom, peace, and prosperity based on universal norms is the fundamental basis for our efforts to establish a sustainable peace on the Korean Peninsula. The denuclearization of North Korea and establishment of a sustainable peace on the peninsula is an indispensable task for all of us to ensure freedom, peace, and prosperity, not only for the Korean people, but also for the region and beyond. Hence, our efforts can be joined and supported by our friends and partners around the world. The United Kingdom, along with the United States, comes first. We will pool our wisdom and insight of like-minded countries like the UK as the birthplace of liberal democracy and free market economy and a leading member of NATO. We will work closely with each other to deal with our common challenges, particularly by coordinating our foreign and security policies to establish a sustainable peace on the Korean Peninsula and keep the free and open Indo-Pacific and rules-based international order. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you very much for that very clear statement. I'm sure there are a number of themes we'll want to come back to in the discussion, just to sort of highlight things for us to think about. I particularly liked your distinction between capabilities and will. We've seen a lot of declaratory policy recently from the Yoon administration, not only the audacious initiative that you described in some detail, but of course recently a new Indo-Pacific policy, which is very closely aligned, I think, with that of the United States. It'll be interesting to look at to what extent Seoul and Washington are on the same page. And you mentioned the TCOG process, which I think is hugely important. We've just seen, of course, in Jakarta, the special envoys for North Korea of both the Republic of Korea and of Japan, and of course the United States, meeting to discuss how best to deal with this nuclear issue. It would be very interesting to think about how that compares to those previous initiatives. And lastly, I think very importantly on the case of the UK ROK relationship, we have now a bilateral dialogue, which is quite comprehensive in terms of areas of cooperation. I think for all of us, all of you as panelists, I'd like to encourage you to think about which of those dialogue elements are the most important for the relationship. But anyway, before we get into questions and answers, let me move to our second presenter, Wee Sung-lak.
Thank you, John. It is my pleasure and honor to speak at the Chatham House. Thank you for the invitation. It has been 7 months since the inauguration of the Yoon Suk-yeol administration. Big differences in foreign policy from the previous administration are notable. They are hawkish North Korea policy and strengthening alliances. In this context, the Yoon administration takes sides with the United States on issues ranging from Indo-Pacific strategy, supply chains, Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, Xinjiang Uyghur to Ukraine. Previous governments have been reluctant to do so because of sensitivity in the rivalry between the United States and China and between the United States and Russia. Obviously, the new government has a clear vision for its strong response to North Korea's threats. It seems to have a clear vision in coordination with its ally, the United States. The United States welcomes this, calling for more participation in the checks on China and Russia. Objectively, as North Korea rushes to nuclear and missile provocations, South Korea cannot but take a stronger stance toward North Korea. The Korea-US alliance also needs to be strengthened. With the international order shifting to a harder confrontation between the United States-led camp and China-Russia camp, a country like South Korea, an ally of the United States, and a big trading power that is deeply connected to the West, cannot stand in an ambiguous position. We cannot help but go together with the United States and the West. Therefore, the Yoon government's policy is steps in the right direction. The question is how to deal with the reaction from North Korea, China, and Russia, which is the inevitable consequence of the new policy direction. This will be a new challenge. If it is not effectively managed, the relations with North Korea, China, and Russia could deteriorate drastically. This would reduce the room for diplomacy, for denuclearization, peace, and reunification of the Korean Peninsula. That was the situation Korean diplomacy experienced during the Cold War. At that time, South Korea was cut off from North Korea, China, and Russia at the forefront of the Cold War. Korean diplomacy in the 21st century cannot go back to that situation. Already, North Korea has dramatically increased the level of provocation since the inauguration of the new government. The possibility of military conflict cannot be ruled out. China is sounding a warning as South Korea leans toward the United States. China demanded South Korea take 5 must-do measures. The demands smell of infringement on South Korean sovereignty. China may think that the new government's foreign policy direction is the most unfavorable to China since the normalization of diplomatic ties. Until now, China may have believed that it has successfully tamed, quote and unquote, South Korea into being extremely mindful of the core interests over the last 30 years. China may find that the Yoon government is trying to reverse all of these. China will not sit on its hands. Russia publicly warned of a breakdown in bilateral relations, citing South Korea's decision to provide weapons to Ukraine. It is uncertain whether the Yoon government has a comprehensive strategic vision to deal with the entire North Korean issue other than a vision to deter the threat from North Korea. Of course, the Yoon government announced so-called audacious initiative to North Korean policy, which comprises negotiation strategies. North Korea flatly denied it. Moreover, it is unclear whether there is a strategic vision to deal with China and Russia. We are waiting for that yet. Furthermore, it is unclear whether the new government has a vision for a global actor who can respond credibly to security challenges, not only in Asia, but also in Europe and elsewhere. Someone would say that the new government's emphasis on values such as freedom and international solidarity for the defense of freedom is something like this vision. But the government's rhetoric on defense of freedom has not been sufficiently followed by actions, particularly regarding matters related to Ukraine or China. The government is still cautious about aiding Ukraine and has not shown a consistent response to freedom and human rights issues concerning Ukraine or China. They are new challenges posed by the Yoon government's new foreign policy. The government needs to properly address them. However, there is a domestic environment that could have a negative impact on the government's foreign policy. First, the government's approval rating is relatively low. Second, the confrontation between the ruling and opposition party is extreme, making it easy for the opposition party to throw all-out objection to the government's foreign policy. This means that in addition to external challenges, the government needs to address these internal challenges as well. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for presenting some of those challenges, which I think give us a sense of the gravity of the problem. And I'm sure we will want to come back to that question of domestic politics, particularly as it relates to the question of China. And we've seen a rise in anti-Chinese sentiment in South Korea in recent months and years. And in all of this, of course, I'm reminded of the fact that we've now seen just a few weeks ago Chinese and Russian aircraft intruding into South Korea's ADIZ, Air Defense Identification Zone. This issue of sovereignty, I think, is something that is hugely important. And also another question for us to consider, and picking up on what Ambassador Yoon was saying about this choice between capabilities and will. What are the structural obstacles in South Korean, not only politics, but also the limitations imposed by a one-term presidency in terms of ensuring continuity? What role does the foreign ministry and professional diplomats and the academic community provide in giving that strategic focus in the way that Wee Seung-lak set out so clearly? So I'm sure we'll want to come back to those issues. But domestic politics, of course, in a way brings us finally and conveniently to our last speaker, Jun Hae-won, who I'm sure will want to reflect on that a little bit in looking at the scene, or looking at how Koreans perceive the situation in Europe as well. Over to you, Hae-won.
Hello, thank you for inviting me for this webinar. I remember about 5 years ago, I was invited by Chatham House during Hanoi summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un. So this is a good reminder of how many years has passed. I think I would start with my talk about the opportunities and challenges for closer ties between ROK and Europe, whether it is EU, NATO, or individual European countries. And it's interesting for Ambassador Wee mentioned about China, because I was about to say, I was about to begin my talk saying that China is the opportunities and challenges for closer ties between Korea and Europe, whatever that is. Let me start with opportunities. The rise of China caused the motivations for European countries, EU or NATO, tilt or pivot to Indo-Pacific. Because of this, other than just a global partner for Europe, by European actors, ROK is started to be seen as a regional partner and strategic partner with security interest, such as maritime security, cyber security, and supply chain, things like that. From Korean perspective, China is also opportunity to see Europeans as our strategic partners, because the Europeans coming to Indo-Pacific and South Korea is certainly welcome for us, partly because Korea perceives the European countries as actors to be on its side without tensions with China in the region. Also, European countries have technical expertise, influences, historical ties, and resources to form a network or contributing to existing networks in the Pacific. Of course, long experiences of organizing multilateral cooperation is also advantages Europeans could bring to the Indo-Pacific, given their experience, especially EU and NATO. Now turning to challenges for closer ties between ROK and Europe. Korea and Europe has differences in dealing with China, especially related to China's democracy and human rights issues. Often I hear EU or European countries talking about diplomacy based on principles. So far, however, subsequent to Korean administrations found it difficult to take those issues strongly with China. This is partly because, unlike Europe, Korea should expect ramifications of China for its security, let alone economic retaliation from China. Anti-China policy of Korea takes more risks than anti-China policy of Europe. Another challenge is ambiguities of both Korea and European side on their aims and means on cooperation, especially on security-related issues in Indo-Pacific. I have been in many meetings with the Europeans and Koreans, but I found both Koreans and Europeans asking each other what they want from each other in terms of cooperation in the Pacific, especially on security issues. On the one hand, it is understandable to ask this question to each other at the early stage of cooperation to meet common ground. But on the other hand, sometimes I wonder we spend too much time talking about what to do other than doing things. And I worry that we may lose momentum without concrete actions. The third challenge, I would say, would be from Korean side, is the multiplicity of European actors. Sometimes so many European actors, so confusing institutional structures are confusing for Korea. We have many Europeans with the Indo-Pacific strategy or policy guidelines or policy papers, including EU one and the UK's integrated review, and also NATO's new strategy concept has some part of Indo-Pacific as well. And also they invited us for their summit with the other FE4 countries. So from Korea's point of view, on what issue, where should we go? On which partner would be the best? And even within the EU, sometimes we wonder individual states would be better. And then also UK is not even a member of the European Union anymore. With the limited resources, we should find most effective way and efficient way to cooperate with the Europeans. But it's sometimes too much learning process from Korean side to find the best European partner on certain issues. Finally, again, from Korean perspectives, it is important to be able to connect Korea's cooperation with the European countries in Indo-Pacific to its cooperation with other Indo-Pacific countries, and vice versa, I think. In fact, we are dealing with intense and dense geographical region in the shadow of the Russia-Ukraine war. So we want to have a big picture other than just to have a small component of Korea-EU relations. And we want to know how ROK-Europe cooperation fits into Europe's big Indo-Pacific cooperation as well. Especially Europeans have taken hub and spoke approach with many partners. But sometimes we just don't want to be just a part of this hub and spoke. We want to be connected with other Indo-Pacific countries through European countries. Finally, I would say that one of the ways to address this would be the European countries organize a cooperation network with the Indo-Pacific countries, including Korea. Maybe this sounds audacious, but I would say UK may invite the Korean Navy when they conduct exercise with Japan and other Indo-Pacific countries in the Indo-Pacific region. I stop here. Thank you.
And Professor Jun, thank you for being audacious yourself in giving us a few concrete proposals to think about. Let me start with you, if I may, before raising questions with your fellow panelists. You mentioned the question of China, which I think has been common to all the remarks so far. It's interesting, we've just seen a bilateral meeting, a virtual meeting between Park Jin, the ROK foreign minister, and his Chinese counterpart, the Chinese have been quite assertive in calling out what they describe as hegemonic unilateralism, a reference to the United States domestic economic policy and its foreign implications, including the very contentious issue of the Inflation Reduction Act. This has created a lot of pushback by Korean companies, a perception of unfairness. Can I ask you to reflect perhaps on the impact you think that may have on the ability of the Yoon administration to maintain its close alliance with the United States in dealing with China? How much does the corporate sector and the perceived, and I emphasize perceived, unfairness of the IRA have in terms of influencing these broader geopolitical issues?
Well, I think, I mean, given that I'm working for the government, I should be careful. But I think first, I think the media certainly inflated the difficulties we have. I'm saying this because on one hand, yes, we have difficult car industries with IRA, but on the other hand, my colleagues in the energy sector told me that because of IRA, our battery industries are actually gaining as well. So I think this shows the picture that on one hand, one industry gains, on the other hand, other industry loses. But we should also remember anti-Americanism is always in Korean public's sentiment to a certain extent. So always we have some incidents which is fired up by certain actions by US. On the other hand, I would mention that these actions, which certainly Europeans also agree that this is a kind of difficult to deal with the free trade principles, how countries, even the US, the biggest and most powerful country in the world, found it difficult to deal with the international obligations with the domestic politics. And it's not just a question of the US, but I think all other countries. That's why on one hand, other countries worry that even Europeans could take similar actions or to protect their industries.
Okay, thank you. That's very, very helpful. A question, if I may, to Wee Sung-lak, picking up on the point that Professor Jun made about what I would call regional security architectures. The hub and spokes model has been a long-standing part of Cold War relations between the United States and its alliance partners. To what extent do you believe that there's a need for new mechanisms or new architectures to deal with both the challenge of North Korea and, of course, the wider security challenge posed by China? We have often seen South Korean administrations being quite innovative in thinking about new models of cooperation. But we, of course, have a lot of different mechanisms. The ASEAN +3 mechanism, Ambassador Yoon mentioned TCOG, an earlier incarnation of trilateral cooperation. Is there one particular forum that you think is best suited for the Republic of Korea in advancing some of these critical security strategic interests, or do we need new ones? That's a question to you, Wee Sung-lak.
The security environment on and around the Korean Peninsula is rapidly changing, particularly the threat of North Korean nuclear missile is mounting. And on top of that, the rivalry between US and China, US and Russia is also very much sharpened. So having said all these new security situations, I believe we need some type of new security thinking approaches other than a bilateral network of alliances. I'm not sure whether we will need at the moment a new architecture type of things, but I'm in favor of new approaches which involve multilateral coordination and cooperation. for Korea, one of the basic of the basics is the trilateral coordination with among Japan, South Korea, and the United States. That will be a good base. And we can reach out to other regional powers like Australia and others. And even we can reach out to European countries like UK and some NATO countries. My government is paying attention to that, and also the European states are also paying attention to that. One of the good example is the latest communication and cooperation between the NATO and the AP4, Asia Pacific 4 countries, including South Korea. And also, I understand that South Korea named a permanent representative to the NATO. That's the first ever step made by the new administration. So I'm in favor of multilateral approach. I'm in favor of more coordination and reaching out, but I'm not sure whether it is the time to organize a new security architecture, because it has to be a gradually and evolving way, considering the reaction from the other side, China and Russia, considering the geopolitical sensitivity of South Korea. We need to move on a step-by-step and gradual way.
Thank you for those observations. And let me pick up on this question of values with a question to Ambassador Yoon, and also draw on a question that's been raised in the Q&A section by Jeffrey Robertson, who asks, audacious initiative, global pivotal state, Indo-Pacific strategy as mentioned by panelists. There's a lot of rhetoric, he says, and not much action. What actions are we looking for specifically to say these initiatives are more than just rhetoric? Let me put that hardball question to you, Ambassador Yoon, and invite you to comment on Jeffrey Robertson's observation.
Thank you. Thank you for the very pertinent question about the action that should back our rhetoric, as you called. But I think the Yoon administration has been clear about its intention and its will to act from the day one. And the summit we had with the US President Biden was within 2 weeks after the inauguration. And just like Ambassador Wee mentioned, the Korean president joined the NATO summit as part of AP4. That is unheard of. And as Ambassador Wee relevantly pointed out, that's the point when the Indo-Pacific theater was connected to Atlantic community. So this means that we are joining the international community in upholding, as I said, the universal norms and values in action. So with that connection already made, there will be many consultations and joint, if you will, operations that we can take up, and then that will further consolidate our unity of action. So it's been only 7 months after our inauguration, and there have been a lot of actions and decisions that have been made up. So I think we will see more of those actions and concrete steps that we will take down the road.
Ambassador, can I follow up on that and ask you for your assessment of the public mood in Seoul when it comes to global security issues, and particularly over the Ukraine, because this is now, of course, a hugely important question for not just South Korea, but so many governments. How do you maintain public engagement with the events in the Ukraine? Do ordinary Koreans feel that this is a crisis that is relevant to their own lives, do you think? And if not, what can be done to create more of a sense of a connection?
I think that's a very, very important question. You may remember that there was a debate during the presidential race about the implication of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, whether it's kind of in Korean expression, the fire on the other side of the water, or is it really a crisis that has implications for us? So we should see, I mean, the Korean people should see the implication of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia to us, because it is an encroachment upon the existing international order that has been in place for centuries. The president already said that I think it was in ASEAN summit that we cannot accept the change of status quo by force. So we clearly declared or announced that the invasion by Russia of Ukraine was violation of UN Charter and international law. We cannot accept it, because if this encroachment or violation of international law and the existing order is condoned, that will happen again here and there, and East Asia or Indo-Pacific will not be exception. So for my part, I'm trying to bring this point home to the Korean people. And as you mentioned, the inattention and indifference to what's going on the other side of the globe was exemplified by the lack of attention paid by the Korean National Assembly members to the video address by President Zelensky of Ukraine. That was lamentable. But after that, there was, I think, a little bit of backlash about that kind of embarrassing moment. And then people in Korea are paying more attention to what's going on in Ukraine. And they are little by little now seeing this confrontation between free world and autocracies. And then where do we stand? I think that's a very important question. And the Yoon administration is trying to have a clear position on this, and then that should be recognized by the Korean people. And in that regard, I think we diplomats, or public people, those who work on this public discourse, have the responsibility to spread this implication to our people in general.
And Ambassador, that's a really, I think, very helpful reminder of how the division of political responsibilities between what used to be the Blue House, the President's office, and the parliamentary side of politics, the National Assembly, with, of course, divisions of power and the dominant position of the opposition in the National Assembly complicating matters. With politics in mind, turning to Professor Jun, to what extent you've had a lot of meetings with Europeans on the issue of Ukraine, are you hearing much of a sense of desire for more activism by the ROK in your discussions? Does it feature very much as part of the discussion? And if I can add a second question to you, which relates to economic matters raised by Edward Howell, who's based at the University of Oxford. Edward asks, the UK has recently revised proposals to negotiate an enhanced FTA with South Korea, free trade agreement. What does the action signal about the broader UK-ROK relationship? Not just in the economics and trade sphere, but more broadly, do you think? So two questions, if I may, to you. One on Ukraine and one on trade.
Yeah, I think I will start with the second question first, because it's short to answer. I think Howard knows that our current FTA with UK is kind of a cut and paste from the EU-Korea FTA, which is more than 10 years old. So anyway, we are in talk of how to modernize our EU-Korea FTA in the first place. So of course, we should have a new FTA with the UK, which was agreed even when we had this current FTA, which is interim one. Yeah. So that's so on one. I would say in brief, technically we have to have a new FTA with the UK anyway, and in broader terms, on UK and the Korea relations, I think if you look at UK-Japan relations, Korea and UK relations could learn a lot how to proceed, because UK and Japan had a new FTA, which is even more advanced than Japan EU FTA, with the digital chapter, things like that. So we may think about that because digital area is not just about the economy, also security implications, and then also economic security implications as well. So that is one thing. Another is we also aware that UK and Japan has revived their security cooperation in many ways, including joint development of fighter jets, things like that. So we may consider how we could apply this kind of framework between to Korea and UK relations. One suggestion from me would be, since the UK has been active to mobilize their shipbuilding industries to build a better navy, and Korea is interested in building our navy in a better way as well. So that could be one of the ways for us to do it. On Ukraine, I think the Europeans are generally happy about what we have done on Ukraine, but they have huge expectations on two areas. One is when the war ends somehow, how to rebuild Ukraine in various ways, economy, security, and all these different ways. I think they have expectations for us in a very high ways. And on broader things, the European security, everyone aware that how many weapons we have sold to Poland. And the Korean industry, weapon industry, is very happy to help European security become stronger. And in that sense, I think not just helping Ukraine, but I think Korea could help European security capability building after the war.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for shifting our perspective to the medium to long term. I think that's a really important issue. Ambassador Wee, a fellow former ambassador, Warwick Morris, asks two questions. And if I can ask the first question to you, Wee Sung-lak, alongside, of course, the trilateral cooperation between the US and its primary allies, Korea and Japan in Northeast Asia, there's another trilateral forum that has delivered some progress, and that's between, of course, South Korea, China, and Japan, with the secretariat for that forum in Seoul. Warwick Morris asked, what's the mood in Seoul today about the nature of that form of trilateral cooperation? Could you reflect a little bit on that in your perspective?
Another trilateral among South Korea, China, and Japan, that has not been working properly for years. There are a couple of reasons. One is awkward relationship between Seoul and Beijing, but also the relationship between Tokyo and Beijing are not so well. So as a result, this trilateral summit body hasn't been working for many times. But still, I believe it is a valuable base for regional coordination. As long as Korea has a geopolitical issue, as long as Korea has to handle peninsula issue, which involves denuclearization, peace building, and eventual reunification, we have to talk to the Chinese. And the regional multilateral talking body is a valuable asset. So I hope it will be revitalized, reactivated. But having said that, considering US-China rivalry and the impact of war in Ukraine, I think the short-term prospect is not so bright for the reactivation of this body. And the China, as long as the first trilateral body, Seoul, Tokyo, Washington, is very active, China sees second body not in a favorable fashion.
Okay, thank you. And the second part of Warwick's question, I'll pass to Ambassador Yoon, which is about missile defense. We've seen missile defense, of course. The THAAD controversy led to very acute tensions between Beijing and Seoul, with the Yoon administration much more officially combative on some of these issues. What does the future for missile defense look like, both in terms of deployment of missile batteries, but also from your perspective in terms of added institutional cooperation, Ambassador Yoon?
Yes, we all remember what we went through with the THAAD deployment, and it is still going on. But Korea has never announced its intention to officially join the missile defense system by the United States. So we are a little off from that posture yet, but we may consider many means possible to shield ourselves from the barrage of a variety of missiles that North Korea has already displayed. So it's a kind of a responsibility for the Korean government to find a way to protect its people in any way it can. So we cannot rule out anything. But at the moment, I haven't seen any concrete steps to joining the missile defense system of the United States. But as ambassador, we recognized we have been strengthening our alliance, and then we've been talking about many options to strengthen our defense, combine the defense posture. So we will consider many options, but at the moment, I have almost nothing to say about missile defense.
Okay, thank you. Let me turn to the question, the inevitable question of North Korea and the nuclear crisis, because we have a couple of questions that relate to that. With somewhere in the region of 63, I think, missile launches by North Korea in the course of this year, there's a great deal of anxiety and also an expectation that sooner or later there will in fact be a 7th nuclear test. Seong John asks, amid reports that the 3rd tunnel at Pyongyang, the testing site for North Korea's nuclear capabilities, is now complete. If there were to be a test, do you expect that there will be any difference in the response of the Yoon administration compared to previous governments? And I'd like to ask each of you to comment on that, maybe starting with Ambassador Wee.
Our response will be basically along the line of our previous approaches, but with more intensity and strength. We seek stronger sanction multilaterally and unilaterally and minilaterally. But obviously, Security Council is in dysfunction. It was evident since North Korea launched ICBM. China and Russia are blocking the passage of resolution, and even China and Russia are blocking the passage of the lower level of steps in the Security Council. So if that happens, in the case of nuclear test, that will be a really big issue in the value of Security Council. But if that multilateral approach is not successful, and we will seek unilateral or even unilateral sanctions and pressure. And also that may trigger further moves on the part of Seoul and the part of Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo. More coordination in security cooperation, more movement along the way of deterrence, and so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you. And moving to Professor Jun, just keeping in mind, I think that the European Union has just announced its own new package of sanctions against North Korea. What is your sense about the opportunities for the administration in dealing with North Korea? Will that be different from previous administrations? And what room is there for enhanced coordination between Seoul and Brussels, or Seoul and individual countries on this issue, do you think?
Okay, this may sound very sarcastic, but I would say that I think we tried everything with North Korea, including what we have done with Hanoi. I think I remember when we had this Hanoi summit, like many of my colleagues dealing with the North Korea issue said that now we tried everything. Yeah, and then it's apparent even before the end of Moon's administration, it failed. So with that in mind, the public wouldn't imagine we could resolve this somehow in the near future. So that gives a lot of room, I think, to Yoon administration domestically. Yeah, I think that's one point. Internationally, I think you remember that European Union, even during this rapprochement between Trump and Kim Jong-un, didn't lift any sanctions at all. Yeah. So this, from European Union's point of view, this is just in line with their previous approach and increasing the level of sanctions. So there is a continuity in the international area of North Korea. So in that sense, I think it is easier for Yoon administration to ask cooperation from our partners to deal with North Korea in very, very strong terms.
Thank you. Ambassador Yoon, just on that question about how to deal with North Korea, we have another question in the Q&A box from Ian Sheridan about Kaesong, Kaesong Industrial Complex, which of course was something that progressive and conservative administrations, at least at different stages, embraced as a form of engagement. You've talked about the audacious initiative. In light of everything we've just heard, do you think there's any room for a revitalization of Kaesong, or is that effectively dead now at this point?
But before we get to that, I'd like to go back to the Ukrainian issue and its implication, because I first talked about the global implication for the international order, but it had the practical implication for Korea, because as Ambassador Wee mentioned, it froze, it paralyzed the Security Council at the United Nations, and then it provided the window opportunity for North Koreans to go ahead and test, so many missiles with impunity. So they needed the data to improve their missile capabilities, and that was the window. And then they went ahead with the 63 launches. Of course, some of them were before the invasion, but this was a very good opportunity for them. And then, what President Putin mentioned about possible use of tactical nuclear weapons also, in a way, inspired the North Korean leader. And then they even put it into legislation, the unilateral use of tactical nuke in an offensive fashion, not as deterrence. So the Ukrainian situation is not one that is totally detached from Korean Peninsula, and it already had those impacts on us. So I'd like to mention that. And then about the audacious initiative, I also like to underline the trilateral coordination that I mentioned, but not only on diplomatic front, but also on the defense and military front, because we are now working on information sharing among the three countries about the North Korean missile trajectory and everything. So that will strengthen our capability to deal with those provocations, and that I don't think we have time to give a whole spectrum of our initiative, but now we are still at the deterrence stage, but this deterrence should be really tight, so that it will create the strategic environment where North Koreans see that there is no hope, there is no gain in continuing their nuclear and missile programs. So that they will have no other option but to come back to the negotiating table and then take a look at the generous offer we are making. So that I wanted to make. And Kaesong was a very good example of inter-Korean cooperation for years, but there was a matter of trust that which was a very essential element for that cooperation to continue, and then that trust has dried up. So without that trust, it will be very difficult to put the resources and the capability of Korean companies at the hands of North Koreans. We really love to work with the North Korean labor who really work very hard, and we appreciate that. We'd like to let them experience what we had for the decades, for the last decades. But the environment that we are in is not conducive to such an opportunity. But we really hope that once we get into the negotiation and once we have the brighter picture for the future of North Korea at hand, that will be a very important component of our cooperation, I guess.
Thank you, Ambassador. You mentioned the limitations of time, and unfortunately, we are pretty much out of time. I just want to give each of you 30 seconds in case there's any burning issue that you feel that we haven't touched upon, that you feel would be relevant based on what we've just discussed in terms of thinking about this question of South Korea as a strategically capable actor. So, Professor Jun, any thoughts? Final 30 seconds.
Well, I would just say Europeans come to Seoul with the concrete proposals on Indo-Pacific. We are more than welcome for anything.
Okay, that's good. That's a very receptive offer. Thank you. Ambassador Wee?
Well, we have a rising China issue, while Europe has a Russia issue. And in the wake of war in Ukraine, we and all of us has to handle these two issues in an integrated and comprehensive way. That's the space where South Korea and some East Asian democracies can work with European states, including United Kingdom. I think current administration in Seoul has certain intention to move in that direction, more, in other words, more global contribution. But the details are not come yet. We'll have to see what will happen. Anyway, today's discussion was very fruitful for South Korea and the United Kingdom and Europe to find a way forward. For that matter, I appreciate the Chatham House arrangement, and I also thank you, John, for your hosting and leading the discussion with much excellence. Thank you.
My pleasure. And Ambassador Yoon, you have the last word.
All right. Thank you very much, John, for this opportunity. And then I also appreciate the inputs by Professor John and Ambassador Wee. Professor John, for your insight and your expertise in EU and European issues. And Ambassador Wee, as ever, you are such a man of wisdom and strategy on our part, on our profession. And I appreciate your nice words about the right steps that this new administration is taking, but also his advice and the word of caution that should also be taken into account for the administration to work on this grand design. And I think that's up to practitioners like us to further refine and sophisticate our approaches so that we can navigate through all the loopholes and pitfalls and achieve our intended goals. So, and with the UK, my last words is that the UK is such an important strategic partner for Korea. So, not only with the economic area like FTA, but with the strategic area of military and security policy, I hope we will have a closer partnership. And then we will work on the document the two leaders adopted in June. It was only 1 month after the inauguration of our new administration, the bilateral framework for closer cooperation. So we have a very good reference there, and then we only need to work harder on that. So thank you for this opportunity, and we will work harder, just like any other Koreans. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Yoon, for reminding us how industrious Koreans are. The final thought, my takeaway is I was struck by the range of issues we covered, the complexity of those issues, and Ambassador Wee, your reference to an integrated and comprehensive approach, I think, is a measure of the scale of the challenge of thinking strategically, not just for Korea, but for any actor. And within that, I'd include the United Kingdom with its Global Britain strategy. So it's a sobering reminder of just how difficult it is to formulate policy when the world is so complex, challenging, and changing at such a rapid pace. But I think we've had a very fruitful discussion. I've certainly learned a great deal. I hope our audience has enjoyed the dialogue and had the opportunity to have their questions addressed. Let me end by thanking again the Korea Foundation, the TJ Academy, and above all my colleagues at the Asia Pacific Programme for making this event possible. And I hope there will be other similar opportunities for us to raise these Korea-related issues. But thank you again to my three participants, and we look forward to engaging in the future.